Now, if you define, oh, sorry, I've got a little, this meeting is being recorded. That's good. Thank you for remembering that. If you define history in some way similar to like the curated representation of the past, and you accept that the curated representation of the past can be done by lots of different media. If you accept those things, I think then you have to accept that historical games are gamic histories. We can call them gamic histories. I'm not a big fan of ludic. I just don't like how it sounds, so I'm going with gamic. And it's critical, scholars of historical film have shown us this, that the historical medium needs to be understood in its own terms, not as a defective form of text, but in its own terms. So the historical problem space framework is designed to address two foundational questions. And these are not the only questions worth examining, but they're the two that this is designed to deal with. How does the medium of a game shape and transform historical content? And how do game mechanics represent and model the documented past? And this is not, instead of looking at it in terms of narrative, instead of looking at it in terms of dialogue trees and things like that, it's just a focus on this particular thing because it's an important thing to focus on in our disparate work. Other thing, historical for me, when I'll use historical, documented past, and historical record. And what I mean by that is I mean interpretations of the past that are grounded in critically employed evidence. That's debatable, right? What critically employed evidence can actually tell us about the past. But that's what I mean when I say things about historical. And it's debatable. And if you're using this in education, I would say the fact that it's debatable is actually one of the strengths. It's not so important what a game represents as how a student can interact with that game and kind of link it to the history that they're studying. So just a little clarifier there. Okay, so historical video games, gamic histories, if you will, they are historical problem spaces. What I mean by that is when a game takes historical content and shapes it, kind of delivers it into its form, its game, it turns them into a thing like this. It has a player agent, there are designed goals, there's a game world that the player agent and the design goals are in. There are elements, agents, obstacles, resources, metrics in that game world. And so the player agent has choices. We might say actions, but I like focusing on the choice part of an action. So choices, strategies, and behaviors. And that whole gamic world is shaped very much by genre conventions. All right, so let's break that down a little bit. And again, I'm hoping I have put together some materials, so blank diagrams and things like that. So as I said, my big hope is that some of you will find that this is useful for your own research and your own teaching. I'm really passionate about it. I think it's a really helpful method. So let's see if I can persuade you. Okay, so I will probably say this a lot. Form shapes content. Historical video games are historical problem spaces. They shape the content into this historical problem space with a player and design goals in a game world and so on, okay? So resisting Nazis, smuggling opium, migrating to a new home from a stolen one, fighting a battle, escaping the plague, whatever historical content that it is, if it's going to be dealt with in a game, that game is going to turn it into a historical problem space. So the question is, what can we do? If we have this understanding, what can we actually do with this understanding? So what we can do is we can analyze games in granular detail, yet holistically. So we can look at each piece and see how it relates to the other pieces in the design. And we can understand the aspects of a particular design in their relationships to the rest of the design. I'm a big fan of trying to explicate designer meaning, and I know that I know designer authority in text is like authorial or authorial authority, and it's a debatable thing. I would suggest that we actually can learn a thing or two about design decisions, but at the very least, we can learn a thing or two about the design and how these different parts fit together. So, excellent way to get students engaging in close reading. It's a great way to rough out and conceptualize how elements of a design fit together. It grounds analysis if done thoroughly in a close reading of the game, and it often can, not always, but often can provide a deeper analysis to historical representations in a game. So that principle, right, that we're looking at relationships at this sort of gamic system. So let's start with genre conventions. Now, genre conventions are controversial, I know. The term's been taken to task for its imprecision and its muddy boundaries, what is genre? But I'm gonna suggest, I certainly have found there is such a thing as clusters of design conventions, practices, design approaches that produce identifiable trends in many game designs. That doesn't mean the boundaries are very clear. That doesn't mean that one couldn't design outside of genre, but I think it is meaningful to suggest that there are common features to an Assassin's Creed game and common features to Civilization games, and these, at least some of the time, can be distinguished from each other. And that's what I mean by genre. And genre is really important for historical problem spaces because it influences how a particular game presents its content. So let me give you a few examples of that, of genre affecting historical content. So, Hegemony Gold and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The setting for these games is the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century and aspects of Greek material culture in that period. Hegemony is more just focused on the war aspect. Assassin's Creed Odyssey has a lot more going on in terms of material culture and things like that. But for a moment, for this point, I want to focus on the actual representation of the war in these games. So the Peloponnesian War itself, if you're not passionate about ancient history like me and haven't spent time studying it, involved moving armies, navies, and dealing with all the associated logistics of moving armies and navies to a wide variety of places on land and sea, sometimes engaging in heavy infantry battles that are more or less orderly groups of soldiers fighting as units against their foes. So that's a thumbnail maybe of the history. Well, Hegemony Gold, which is in the top left corner, follows the genre conventions of real-time strategy when it's depicting this game. The player agent is unembodied, as we call it, ordering units of soldiers, hoplites they're called, light infantry and so on. There are production costs for new building units. There are fixed buildings and cities to attack, and these are all real-time strategy genres. The units fight in simple formations, and they march as ordered. You control them and you send them in. One of the things the game does that's not as common in early real-time strategy games is it looks at supply. So cities have to have supply lines connecting them to the food systems and to their units. Why doesn't Assassin's Creed Odyssey have these elements? Some of this, right, is because it's a different genre. It's one answer, at least. Assassin's Creed takes the war content and shapes it into an Assassin's Creed game, becoming an embodied player agent with super individual powers that's focused on that avatar, not on units and groups. We'll talk some more about this later, but I think that's a real example of how genre can influence historical content. Valiant Hearts in the third-person puzzle genre, right? You're picking up items and dropping items and using specific items. So poison gas, right? The horrors of poison gas in the First World War becomes a puzzle about mechanically moving pipes around to make sure that they're all connected correctly. And a machine gun nest is a puzzle about distracting the guards and placing dynamite under the bridge sections. That's going to be a very different game experience than Battlefield 1. Which throws the player agent into the thick of a 3D battle. So survival in an actively, quickly moving hostile world is the key. And again, I would say that's a basic genre distinction between the two, even though, of course, there is overlap. Dominations, this takes place on Android too, and iOS. So please somebody write an article on this at some point, how domination follows a historical problem space. It takes the historical content associated with sort of military and architectural history and stuff, and makes it into a Clash of Clans game. There are timer unlocks for everything. The emphasis is on logging in frequently, and all manners of purchases can speed things up, and you can raid other civilizations. So it's global history molded into the Clash of Clans genre. Okay, so genre is an important influence on the parts of the SPS proper. Now let's go into the different components of a historical problem space. First, player agents. Historical games have player agents. This is a point of identity for the player. This is an access point into the game world. And I guess now is probably a good time to mention that sort of big picture in my plans for this. I had an article come out in Game Studies in December, and it's my intention to get a book out on this in a few years, hopefully. I have a lot of game studies research to read. So much of this system comes from my own close read of video games for a couple of decades. There are many places where I'd like to ground myself in the wider field of game studies. So if you're thinking at this point, oh, such and such a person said stuff on this that's important, send me the link. I would love to have your insight as I'm going along. So I bring that up because historical games and this idea of player agency are an important area in game studies. All right, so historical agents represent different kinds of relationships between a game and its historical content, a different kind of relationship between the player agent and the historical record. And by player agent, right, I mean the character that you're assuming as a player. I would also suggest that different types of player agents reflect different designer intentions, but we can leave that aside if that's too controversial. First of all, we've got unhistorical agents. The original Assassin's Creed with Altair. I would argue Cassandra is not a particularly historical agent. B.J. Blazkowicz in Wolfenstein, playing the cat in the coup. The cat is probably unhistorical. I don't know if there was a cat in that actual situation. I think probably not. So unhistorical is there's not a documented historical person that had that sort of identity and that role. Then I'd say they're archetypal ones. This is a really wide net. Characters whose specific existence is not documented, but they're in a historical role. So if you play Call of Duty World War II, Red Daniels, the infantry corporal, is an archetype, right? This person did not exist, but there were infantry soldiers on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. The player agent of the moment in Battlefield 1. These are good examples of archetypal agents. Then there's specific historical agents. You don't find that very often, I think, because it locks in the designers a lot to sort of a pre-established history. Sometimes you see it like in civilization games where you can pick a specific figure, but then you're not actually really acting as that individual figure. You're really more acting like the last group, which is a collective or a group. Age of Empires with its civilizations, the civilization game, Europa Universalis, in Paradox games, Crusader Kings 2. I mean, you're kind of a mix there, right? Because you're an individual member of the dynasty at the time, but you're playing for the dynasty. So those are the historical types, really, that player agents fall into in historical video games. The new area that I've been working on the last few months is how that agent is actually embodied or not in the game space. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, sort of the spatiality, if you will, of the player agent. So these are some new thoughts that I'm thinking and require a lot more work. But I would suggest that there is an important distinction to be made between embodied and unembodied player agents. I want to clarify here because embodied takes on a lot of meanings. Oftentimes it's used in scholarship about player controllers that get your body into the game more than just your hands on the control stick, but like haptic feedback, things like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, does the actual game character have a body of some kind in the game world, or does it not have a body of some kind in the game world? So I would suggest that if it's embodied, your Assassin's Creeds, your first-person shooters, even Papers, Please, you've got an individual story. The camera focuses on the avatar, and arguably that promotes identification with the avatar. Your powers tend to focus on the avatar's body, even when they're fantastical. So the power fantasy in an embodied avatar is look at how amazing they are at fighting and traversing and all these things. Common choices for an embodied avatar are traversing, I just said it, right? Traversing, exploring, and contesting space. In unembodied agents, this is where there is no player agent actually in the world. There's no body. So you're usually represented by a cursor, that means. And it's usually a story about groups, camera focus changes as the player wishes. It doesn't follow, there's no agent to follow around. Power scope tends to be what I'd call an experimenting deity. You get to tweak either commands to people or system variables. I want to raise taxes as a classic example. And you're acting kind of as this god with this ant farm, sort of figuring out what happens when you mess with things. And these games with unembodied agents, your Age of Empires, your Civilizations, things like that, you'll find that traversing and exploring and contesting space are very important actions, but also developing and exploiting. So building things or extracting resources and controlling or owning. I sort of try to distinguish that a little bit from contesting, and I'll talk about that in a second. So just to kind of let you know some of the places I'm going, because I think it's worthwhile, I'd like to give you one example of how a player agent's embodiment shapes historical content. So Assassin's Creed. I'm not in love with Assassin's Creed, I swear. I actually have a lot of problems with how Assassin's Creed represents the past, and it makes it hard to think sometimes. But one of the things that's fantastic is as an illustration of a problem space. So suppose you spent time reading and writing about Greek history and Greek battles. You might look at the top right picture on the screen and see that Cassandra's there and everybody's in this sort of chaotic set of duels one-on-one. And you might say, why does Assassin's Creed Odyssey get Greek battle wrong? Right? You might just separate that out. That's not how Greek battle worked as far as we know. It was units fighting each other. They may not have been perfectly organized, but there was a cultural emphasis on being together, not on going off and dueling as individuals. So why do they get it wrong? But I guess what I would suggest is a better question is to be sort of a little less judgmental and say, why do they depict it this way? And they depict it, I would argue, in this way because it's a game with an individual embodied agent. Organized units of soldiers don't fit a game focused on a mobile individual. They don't fit the individual power fantasy of the person who can leap and fight and do all these amazing things. So the designers, and this excited me when I saw it, the designers transformed a large-scale war with supplies and logistics and all these things going on between tens of thousands of Greeks. And they made it Cassandra's personal Aristeia. Her personal Aristeia is what the Greeks would call when a hero got their chapter and they got to sort of act virtuously and kick butt and all these things. So it becomes Cassandra waiting around like a good Homeric hero, dueling one at a time. But it goes further. Before you even get into that final battle, you weaken the nation. And there's a map there of different nations, as they call it, in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And how do you reduce nation power? Assassinating soldiers individually and burning war chests, burning chests of supplies. Again, it's taking this concept that involved lots of people and processes and turning it into an individual player's action and purview. And then the conquest battle. So again, I think how a player agent, whether they're embodied or not, is an important part of the problem space that designers are creating. Okay, next part, designed goals. Now, absolutely, players can create their own goals. Players are not obligated to follow any goals that designers make. At no point am I suggesting that the player has no part in this. But the historical problem space framework is concerned mostly with how design approaches it. And designers of historical problem spaces, designers of historical video games, have goals. There are goals for the player agent to pursue in that game. They're not bound to pursue them, but they're still there, and the game really takes shape around those goals. Historical games are teleological in their focus. So the player hoping to achieve the design goals will have to make certain kinds of choices. And those choices are an important part of the game's representation of the past. And so a choice of player and a choice of goal generally is going to constrain the game to certain perspectives, certain representations. So a really good question to ask oneself when they're analyzing a game is, whose problem space is being portrayed? It's a very important question. Along the way, as we're talking about design goals, I've found that there's a really important distinction to be made between attenuated goals and triumphant goals. And it's not an either or, it's a sort of a spectrum. Well, first, triumphant goals. Triumphant goals are when winning the game is celebrated, it's connected with some big historical achievement, focusing on, yay, you did it. Attenuated happens when the victory condition occurs, but maybe is less celebrated, maybe still leaves the historical player agent in a rough place, maybe results in the player agent being thwarted. I'll give you some examples. My first one here, if you play Call of Duty World War II, and this is a good example, it's sort of a triumphant victory. It's triumphant insofar as your squad's been together and you've been successful as an American soldier in fighting the Second World War. And so at the end, you have something along the lines of, yay, we did it. Now, that's not completely the case because they have these storylines where agents have been harmed and killed along the way. So it's not like everything is grand and glorious, but it tends to be a bit triumphant. Through the Darkest of Times, on the other hand, sets you up for an attenuated victory, and it is so moving in that sense. As you can see on the slide here, stop the regime is the instructions that are given to players when they start the game, and in fact, they can't. They cannot stop the Nazi regime. So at the end, even if they've gone through and won the strategy game, the victory is attenuated. They get the sense that they resisted Nazi evil, but not that they were actually able to stop it. There's no jumping around saying yay at the end of Through the Darkest of Times. So that's an important distinction. Let me give you another one. Age of Empires 2 and Crusader Kings. In Age of Empires, victory is triumphant. You're victorious, and it's limited. You destroy other civilizations, or you dominate in resource production so much that you make a world wonder, or occasionally on the side you can store up relics, but that requires a certain level of development. But it's binary and it's triumphant. You dominate or you are dominated. And the means to achieving the goals are very much cast in this sort of World of Warcraft mode, not World of Warcraft, I'm sorry, Warcraft 2 mode of real-time strategy. Crusader Kings, on the other hand, victory is not particularly triumphant, and it's quite open-ended. Prestige, right? At the end of your game of CK2, your prestige score is listed for your dynasty, and then they give you the titles and ranks of historical figures and an estimate of what their prestige would be. So it doesn't say you won, it doesn't say you lost. It does give you some metric to go by, but tends to be more attenuated. And on top of this, there are many more ways to get prestige. It's the titles and ranks of your characters and their vassals and winning battles and wars, but also negotiating personal relationships through text dialogues. So the less triumphant victory with the more open-ended success seems to be a bit more historically realistic when it's looking at medieval relationships than, say, in Age of Empires. So it matters a lot, the goals that have been set for the player agent. And then this is one of the best examples. Oregon Trail, which is a classic in the United States. If you're close to 50 like me, then you played this when you were young. It came out in the 70s. Oregon Trail is about US settlers going west and settling territory in Oregon. Now, we know, right, all of that territory was owned and occupied and used by First Nations. And so the game doesn't really focus on that. It focuses exclusively on settler colonists kind of triumphant manifest destiny expansion west, and it doesn't deal with any of the problems involved. When you get to the end of the game, you're congratulated. Victory. They don't tell you the victory, of course, is doing horrific things to people along the way and causing these awful sort of imperialist processes. They say, congratulations. On the other hand, When Rivers Were Trails was designed specifically to give an indigenous perspective on the Oregon Trail. In this particular game, you are robbed of your land. It's in Minnesota, and you have to travel. So you're an indigenous person in the Americas, robbed of your land, and forced to travel to a new place out on the West Coast that's not your home, and survive along the way. Victory in that game means something very different, and it's something I point out to my students as we're looking at it. Victory in When Rivers Were Trails were you survived having your world ripped away from you, and you are now in a completely new place where you'd rather not be because your homeland is gone. That's an attenuated victory and very different from the triumph in Oregon Trail. So the goals and the agents shape the history that the game's giving. All right, one more example. In Civ 6, if you think about the problem space, Civilization 6 has core victories in science and culture and domination. They center around basically imperialist, settler, colonialist action, around world domination. To defeat one's rivals, you have to outproduce, outfight, outspend, right? It's a 4X, explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And so when it comes time to create new player agents, those player agents have to fit functionally within these kind of domination goals. They've got to function within that problem space, otherwise they're just not going to work. It's not going to be a player agent that works. So enter the Cree, an indigenous American people, whose leadership a few years ago expressed some deep concerns about the representation of the Cree in the game as an expansion group and their historically famous chief Poundmaker. And the leadership of the Cree suggested that this emphasis that the Cree were somehow as focused on conquering others and seizing and occupying their land is deeply problematic. It essentially equates the Cree and Chief Poundmaker with the imperialist powers of Europe and America, and say that they're functionally doing the same thing. That's a really problematic viewpoint. It's very troubling. What I would suggest stepping back, though, is it's also an excellent example of a designed Civilization 6 problem space, exerting influence on the newly added content. They've got the problem space, they add new content, and that new content gets shaped to fit the problem space. New player agents are going to fit it, and that's going to lead to these types of portrayals. It's also worth noting, it's an interesting question. Could designers get away with having lots of different player agents? And I don't know what the answer is to that. I suspect that market forces and the desire to have a good game and the desire to have a cohesive game say, no, you really need one player agent. And I bring up We the Revolution here because I love this game, but there's no question the reviewers talked a lot about how the different parts were less developed than they might be. And I would suggest to you, one of the reasons the different parts were less developed is because they chose to represent different problem spaces. You are in this game a revolutionary judge during the French Revolution, but you're more than that. You have the court cases, as you can see in the middle. You have contesting the streets of Paris over on the left. You're actually a military commander at certain points, as you can see over on the right. And there's a whole sort of dialogue treachery game. I would suggest to you that one of the problems they may have faced is they were trying to design too many different spaces and too many different powers for player agents. And so it lacked that cohesion. Still a fantastic game though, check it out. But I think there's something to be said for a designer wanting to probably have a very limited number of problem spaces and agents. That's certainly how it's played out, I would argue, for the last 30 or 40 years of historical games. Okay, now let's move on to the game world. So these are problem spaces. So there's a game world that contains the player agent, if the player agent's embodied, and contains and contextualizes the goals. And also the game world elements. I picked the 50-year-old game Hammurabi because it illustrates that even if it's a game rendered in text, there's an implied game world. You don't have a historical game if you don't have some kind of game world. At least I haven't seen one yet. It's a bit more difficult to categorize game worlds into historical types, but I think there's an important distinction to be made between historically specific geographies, such as what you might find in a Call of Duty or an Assassin's Creed, at least when you're looking at things like bunkers or buildings, and maybe a more archetypal or thematically connected geography, like Age of Empires or Civilization when it's not on the globe mode, or Red Dead Redemption with its stylized views of the American West. So there's going to be this game world. And going back to some actions for players, there's a set of common actions that take place in these game world spaces. I'm up to 5 or 6 now. I'm not trying to list every possible action, but I'm trying to capture the main ones. One of the things that I've been hoping to do is develop a vocabulary that is useful to you all as you're going along and analyzing games. So I'm trying to, come up with those as best I can. I've added exploit because I feel like it's a little different. Traverse is crossing or navigating or moving through for me. Exploring is uncovering places that you haven't seen before. And contesting is literally, right, not letting somebody else into your space. I've added exploit to develop. Develop would be improving, not improving, sorry, that's a value judgment, adding to the land that you're on, like in a civilization game with worker improvements. Exploiting would be extracting something from the land that you're on. And then I'm playing with this idea of control because I feel like contesting a historical space is not the same thing in a game as owning. You know how you have that ownership of space. It's paint the map your color or something like that. So that's where I am now. And it seems to me that embodied agents focus a great deal of their activities on the first 3 and not so much on the other 2. Unembodied agents do have the first 3 in lots of places, but they also tend to add developing and exploiting and controlling as actions that take place in space. So within that game world are game world elements, which is sort of a catch-all term. And there's a variety of different elements that we can talk about. Different kinds of agents, which I'm going to focus on in a little bit. Tools, which I would define as things that unlock or create access to some other thing. Metrics that are measuring things. Resources that are used to purchase or develop things. And obstacles. These elements have a pretty, and again, this is mechanics. Game narrative can add all sorts of richness to this, but in the mechanics themselves, these elements tend to break down pretty simply into things that enable a player agent to achieve their goals or block in some way a player agent from achieving their goals in the game world. Probably some other ones. I haven't really decided what to do yet with like missions and quests. I haven't decided if those really feel to me like they're part of the game world or whether they're just sort of like an organizing structure, and I'm not quite sure. So I'm sure there could be others added to this list, but this is kind of where I am as of today. So let's focus a bit on agents, because I think that's just a really interesting area where we're portraying historically these different things. So lots of overlaps, but you have basically rival and opposing agents. Those are the ones whose primary function in the game is either to compete with the player or to pursue goals that block the player. So like maybe a rival would be trying to win the game themselves by whatever rules the artificial intelligence is playing, as opposed to an obstacle is just trying to block the player from winning. Then we can also look at those that are able to ally with the player agent and provide some benefit to the agent. And of course, in many games, rival and opposing agents can be allied agents at other points. You think about like a Total War or Civilization or things like that. So rival and opposing agents, allied agents, and then subordinate agents. Subordinate agents are under the player agent's direction. So military units in a turn-based or real-time strategy game. And here, I think it can be useful, and I'll talk about this for a little bit, to distinguish between subordinate agents and what we might call minions. So let's just look at some examples of elements in games. If you do a first pass through the darkest of times, you'll see that there's morale, and it's a metric, and it determines whether the resistance group will act or whether it will dissolve and lose. There's a game world location, or game world with locations on a map, each of which have missions, and you can assign player agents there. Not player agents, subordinate agents. Subordinate agents take the form of resistance group members. They are subordinates, not minions. They can quit your group. They can refuse to work with other members. They certainly can be harmed and spotted. So I would say subordinate in that you're giving them orders, but they don't always follow the orders exactly the way you want, and they might refuse them altogether. An opposing agent in the game, the opposing agent in the game, is the Nazis. Functionally, they're really obstacles. They just give you a risk of being caught at different times and places. But the way it's built in with the text descriptions and discussions and the narrative and the artwork, they are effectively the most menacing of rival agents that one could have. Always watching, always there to catch you if you're not discreet enough. Call of Duty World War II, right? Elements in the game: health, ammunition, weapons, architecture and terrain, passable and impassable terrain, cover, obscuring terrain. These are a lot of things that are going on. And you have these allied / subordinate agents, right? You have a squad that goes through with you that can give you different kinds of assistance. I don't actually know for sure what the subordinates in the game are doing, as far as like, are they actively taking shots at enemy players and things like this? I'm not sure. But I do know what they do is they are able to give you bonuses. So Zussman, for example, is the first example of a subordinate agent in the game. And he will throw you a med pack to heal if you click on him. So sort of minion-y, because it's really just giving you a power bonus, but sort of subordinate-like, because they're moving around to different places. So that you might analyze the game that way. These three games do a good job showing you, again, the differences between rival agents, subordinate agents, and minions. So Age of Empires, I'm going to do happily a Twitter paper on this next week. So please check it out at the Middle Ages and Modern Games Conference. So Age of Empires, the other civilizations function as rivals or opponents. Sometimes they're allied. All the players' agents, subordinate allies, are minions, all of them. They go and do exactly what the player tells them to do, go where they're supposed to go, do what they're supposed to do. You click, you order. And this is not medieval lordship, right? This kind of precise control, but it is absolutely real-time strategy control from the late 90s, which is when it was designed. In medieval Total War, medieval 2 Total War, other civilizations, again, are rivals or opposing agents sometimes. But you have minions too, minions in the form of agents like spies and things like that, and they will follow your control completely. The cities themselves, if you have an agent in them and their sort of mood is right, act pretty minion-like, which again is not very much like medieval lordship. But the soldiers themselves have an important subordinate feature. They have a morale level. If you order your soldiers into battle, they may break, they may be afraid, and they may run away, and you don't have complete control over that. So that turning them into subordinates rather than minions, because let's face it, right? Everybody has agency. Being a complete minion, it's too horrific to think about. So having morale in soldiers creates a more complex historical depiction of battle. But again, having cities and castles and agents that are pretty minion-like makes lord-vassal relations not particularly historical. Crusader Kings 2 then goes a step further. Armies are subordinates, but they'll break and flee, and they can't always be commanded to go places, like, for example, when they're routing. But what's really interesting about Crusader Kings 2, I assume 3 is doing this, I haven't had a chance to play it yet. Your vassals and councils in the game are subordinate. They relate to the player agent according to Paradox's personality model. And that personality model focuses on positive and negative opinion. And whether an agent has a positive opinion on the player agent or a negative opinion is going to affect how they interact, whether they help them, whether they supply them with troops, whether they betray them. This makes a huge difference in the resulting game space. So if you were looking at something like medieval political relations and looking at Age of Empires, medieval 2 Total War, and Crusader Kings 3 or 2, the way that they've designed those player agents to be minions or to be more subordinates has a huge impact on the history that's being portrayed. All right, choices, strategies, and behaviors. I'm convinced that this is the part of the historical problem space that is most particular. is most exceptional to historical games. I've been making that claim in one form or another for a decade or more. A simple answer to the question of how does a game render historical content is it renders historical content, It renders historical content by introducing a player agent that has choices about how to act, can form strategies about how to act, and can adopt different behaviors for action. And this is an important place, I think. This is the place I want to do some more work here, and I will hopefully, where it's really a good time to consider analogies with the historical record. Since this is the exceptional thing of a game, this ability to give an agent choices, I think it's a good place to say, what are the historical analogies between the choices available to the player in the game and the choices available to a historical actor? Again, not so much for simplistically saying it's accurate or not, but looking more holistically at what is this whole beast, if you will, of this historical game and how it's representing the past. So, some examples. You won't be surprised at this point that I'm going to show you Assassin's Creed Odyssey. When it comes to player agent actions and their historical analogs in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the crystallizing moment for me, and I wish I had taken a screenshot at the time, but you can see the temple there. I was standing on top, my Cassandra was standing on top of the temple. I had this sign that said Militarized Temple of Megara. And I was looking around at, like, I guess it was probably about 15 feet below in the drop. And I was looking to see who I could drop on and assassinate. And so I did a stealth attack on the leader of the enemies that were there. There were 3 or 4 soldiers there. So I dropped from the roof. I killed this guy in one shot. Cassandra is using her Spartan kick with another person to knock him right off a great height, which killed him. And I'm feeling like, you go, Cassandra, you've got this. You're really kicking butt. And that's when you get to the point in a game like this where it's worth noting, particularly if you're a student analyzing, but I think it's important for pro analysts too, you've got an unhistorical figure, at most highly fantasized. They talk about this idea of a mythios, this archetype of a mercenary. Did people drop from roofs and spear their enemies this way? Sure, anything's possible in the past. Do we have any documented evidence that this was going on? No, we don't have any. So I say unhistorical figure. In a somewhat specific but very archetypal historical space. So there's geography, right? And Ubisoft prides themselves on their realistic geography. But a lot of it's very archetype-like. Here are hills, here's rocky mountains and stuff like that. It's not a satellite image. That unhistorical figure in a somewhat specific but archetypal historical space has the primary goal of finishing all the missions. And they're finishing all the missions through the secondary goals of leveling up by gaining experience from exercising personal abilities like exploration, assassination, and open combat, and gaining better equipment through theft, discovery, spoils, and crafting. So the Peloponnesian War in this game is going to be represented like that, as the purview of an agent who has choices about who to assassinate and how to become physically more terrifying and advanced over time, and navigating through the space. A lot of time, right? A majority of Cassandra's in-world game time is based on traversing, killing, and picking stuff up. There's a fair amount of dialogue interaction with the game agents to get the missions and goals to level up, absolutely. But the majority of their time mechanics-wise is traversing, killing, and picking stuff up. And that's not a criticism, that's just an analysis. That's how it's representing history. We could talk here, right, about like the fetishization of objects in these games. You can always get new gear and new loot. Through the darkest of times. So in this case, it's the Nazi dictatorship in Germany and the road to the Shoah. And the player agent is the leader of a Nazi resistance group with the goal of stopping the regime. As I told you, that blood red text on the first slide says, stop the regime. The development of the player agent is interesting here because they're kind of embodied, but I would argue it's sort of a borderline, a sort of a liminal field. The player agent is not embodied insofar as you can drag on your different resistance members, drag them and assign them to different missions, and that's all very much true of an unembodied player agent. but they actually give you a personal character that's you. You get to design a character that you send on missions as well. So it's sort of a mix in between. And I think the reason it's a mix in between is because they were going for the strategy approach, which really works very well with an unembodied player agent giving orders, but they wanted to personalize the danger to you as the player. So they created an actual player agent that's embodied. So there's a sense of more investment in the dangers of facing the Nazi regime. So you undertake a series of missions. These are part of your choices and strategies, a series of missions with a set of resistance members and a set of resources. You can get more missions, you can get more intelligence, you can get more resources to undermine and resist the Nazis. Though again, you're never going to succeed completely. So it's a strategy game that provides those strategic placements and ordering. But interestingly, there's a text element too, where you are an embodied player agent effectively talking to different people about the horrors of the Nazi regime. So your choices are who and what to risk, what techniques to apply for resistance, how to allocate your resources. And again, these are intensified by the interactive text choices, which do have game world effects. So arguably, Through the Darkest of Times is more closely analogous to the historical record than Assassin's Creed Odyssey is to its when it comes to the actual choices that the player agent is making. They created a problem space where the expectation of stopping the regime may be high, but the basic act of resistance is a noble goal in and of itself, and a really hard one to achieve at that. So, can we really say, though, with these games? So here I put up Call of Duty World War II and Unity of Command 2, which is a strategy game. Can we really say that one's historically accurate and one's not? I would suggest that that's way too simplistic. There's too much going on. If you look at choices in Call of Duty World War II, they focus on the embodied player agent and their personal powers. What gear to take, who to target, where to move, when to duck and cover. You're navigating, you're traversing, and violently contesting the spaces around you. And those are your main choices, where to go and how to contest the space around you. And in this version, you also have the choice of squad mates where they each have abilities that you can use. And notice, right, the squad mates have been turned into abilities, into power-ups. It's fitting again within this functional game design. So the game keeps the focus on the incorporated player agent, the individual protagonist of the game world, okay? Now, is that inaccurate? There are certainly elements that are very inaccurate, but what it will give you that a game with a disembodied player agent, like a Unity of Command, doesn't give you is the choice of how to storm a bunker, the choice of how to interact with different enemies in a close contested space. So it's not enough to sort of blanketly, or at least we shouldn't kind of limit ourselves to saying historically accurate or not accurate. Instead, talk more about the problem space as it's designed and how it shapes things. So Unity of Command 2. In this particular case, you're an unincorporated agent. You're a commander that's marshaling subordinate units, and you have quite a bit of control over movements and their targets. They don't have names like the squad mates do in Call of Duty. They just have unit designations. So Call of Duty goes into the personal and the individual. Arguably, there is more, let's say, material to think about and material connect to the past in Call of Duty when it comes to storming a bunker. And there is more about any particular allied invasion and the different components and different units in it in Unity of Command 2. So the question is, what kind of historical analogies are we drawing? Which one offers the more analogous choice to what sort of history? Assassin's Creed Odyssey and LA Noire. LA Noire is probably somewhere in between. Shout out to Esther Wright for helping me with understanding this game. It seems to have a somewhat more historically analogous sets of player agent choices, strategies, and behaviors. You are somewhat a detective in a sort of visually somewhat realistic Los Angeles, investigating, arresting, questioning, and charging agents. That doesn't mean it's historically accurate, But it does suggest that there is a closer map between what that player character is doing and what a historical player in that position, a historical agent, sorry, in that position, that of a Los Angeles detective might be doing, than say an Assassin's Creed. On the other hand, it's an open question and worthy of discussion whether it's a more accurate presentation, or rather whether it maps. See, I do it too. I get into accurate myself. Whether it maps more onto the history than Call of Duty or another first-person game. All right, Age of Empires 2 and Crusader Kings 2, the choices. In Age of Empires, placing buildings, choosing techs, producing units, and ordering your minions around. Build a strong army, dominate. Build a resource engine, dominate. Right? And so your choices on a very broad level might, if we say you were trying to fight and fight to win, if we were very general and simplistic, they might work, but they don't really map on that much to historically what was going on with leadership. Certainly not in medieval Europe, and arguably not in the global medieval world as well either. This sort of building these minions that go as fast as you want, or go where you want them to, and fighting these simplistic battles to the death. Crusader Kings, on the other hand, your core choices are about managing relationships, modulating opinions, and you've got all sorts of positive and negative actions you can do, marriage alliances and gifts and plots and who the tutors are for your children and all these things. You choose counselors from imperfect candidates, and they will not follow you absolutely. It depends upon their personal opinion of you. You'll work within a council to rule the realm through subordinates. You'll engage in a series of supply and logistics decisions for your levies that, again, don't always follow you. So the choices are much more about modulating an individual's relationship with other agents in the game than you find in an Age of Empires. And arguably in that respect, it's a better analog to the historical realities that it represents. But you still can't say that one's more accurate blanketly. I mean, Age of Empires has more agriculture built into it, in that you make little fields and you send your little workers to the fields and they harvest food. Last time I checked, Crusader Kings didn't have that. So is Age of Empires more accurate now? No, we're just looking at the different parts in the problem space and how they represent them. And so I think at some point, this is something I need to sort out, there's a spectra of player agents and of historical types, of spatial incorporations and analogous choices. There are all sorts of gamic approaches to these things, and I want to think a lot more about them, and I'm learning from all my colleagues here when you're thinking about them. There are probably certain types of player agents that lend themselves to certain types of choices, as I've suggested. An embodied agent may be for choices about an individual character, and a disembodied agent maybe when looking at sort of grand level ordering and moving of peoples and groups. So an area for more work, but something to think about. So here we are. I appreciate your time very much. It's really great that you've been along with me. It's even exciting, even though I can only see my PowerPoint screen and not you. I just want to leave you with some final thoughts. If I'm fortunate, maybe I've made a connection or two that you'll find helpful, and you'll be able to use this framework I've developed in your teaching and analysis. And I truly hope so. I want this to be useful. And again, the questions that it answers, and I think it helps answer whether you're analyzing or educating with games or designing games. How does the medium of a game shape and transform historical content? And so I've tried to give you a sense, an overview of it shapes and transforms historical content into a problem space. How do game mechanics represent and model the past? And they do so in the form of a problem space with its different features. And so we've talked about genre and different agents, and I've tried to give some good examples of how these things work. So I'm really hopeful that you'll have some questions, because I'd love to talk about this. And on top of that, as I said, if you find this useful, then it has been time well spent. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it, and your attendance.
Great. Thank you very much for your talk. I will open the chat so we can have some questions come in. And of course, if any of the participants, if you're comfortable enough being recorded, you are welcome to raise your hand, turn on your camera, and I will pick and choose as I can do as the host who gets to ask. But otherwise, the chat function is now open, so please feel free to write some questions or comments that you might have about the presentation. Oh, we have a first question already. I will read it out if that's okay with you. I don't know if you can. Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for the great presentation. I have been wondering, why is the talking with historical agents as an action so sidelined in your model? Does not the emphasis on exploitation, contestation, etc. reflect some kind of a ideology in a neutral sense about meaning of history? Can't the historical games be more about exploring, forming stories rather than achieving goals? Not everyone plays Assassin's Creed Odyssey in a completionist playstyle, and this is from Jakub. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Thank you, Jakob. Great questions. I mean, the simple reason is I haven't moved into the area of looking at narrative elements very much. What I'm interested in, so if I was doing a problem space analysis of Through the Darkest of Times, and I have done that up on Play the Past, please give it a look. I do work with how the narrative is part of it, but what I'm interested in mostly, just as an area of interest, is the mechanics of the game and what they're saying about the past. So absolutely, right? It is absolutely the case that narrative and dialogue are important parts of how the past is portrayed. This just happens to be the area I'm working on. What I want to see is, to what extent do the narrative sequences and the dialogue sequences actually do the heavy lifting? So for example, in a game with an individual embodied player agent, it seems like the narrative actually does more of the work of presenting the history than maybe in an unembodied player agent, like a strategy game. What was the second part of that list? There was a second part of that question.
Yes, so let's see. Where's the talking of historical agent? Yes, does not emphasis on the exploitation, contestation reflect some kind of ideology about meaning of history?
Yeah.
And then the third part,
sure.
Yes, no, go ahead, maybe second, and then I will read the third again.
Okay, so the other part, absolutely, players can choose to do whatever they want within a game. I'm trying to focus on the reality that I have not seen a game yet, a historical game. This is bad, right? This is like, I've never seen a black swan, and then all of a sudden we see black swans, and we know that, right, that they exist in the world. I have not seen a historical game yet that didn't have designed goals for the player. So I'm trying to capture that reality of what designers are doing. They're gonna have goals, even though the player could be freely going around the world. I asked myself that, right? Because we've got walking simulators as a new genre. So far, I don't think we have a walking simulator historical game yet. Can somebody do that? Yes. Can they not have any goals for the player? Sure. My question is, how often will designers choose to do that given their constraints and what they're trying to achieve as designers? And I guess at the moment, it seems like most or all are focusing on having a goal-oriented experience for players. So that's kind of where I'm going. But these are great questions.
The third part was, can't the historical games be more about exploring, forming stories rather than achieving goals, as not everyone plays AC Odyssey, for example, in a completionist playstyle? I think it relates to what you just said, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we could talk about player historians too, right? And many of us do, and the meaning that they make out of the game as they go along. So yeah, your points are great. Thank you.
We have another question from Brett. I'm particularly interested in historical empathy, i.e. the identification of player and the agents they're embodying during play. Are there any examples of games that come to mind as good examples of providing particularly closely analogous choice to historical figures? choices to historical figures?
So I think I keep going back to Through the Darkest of Times because I think they did a fantastic job with this game. And what struck me, oh my gosh, I forgot to mention Cat in the Coo, but we'll get to that at another point. Cat in the Coo is an embodied agent too. It's just a cat that happens to be the agent rather than a human. Anyway, Through the Darkest of Time, I think hopefully I can get Paint Bucket to do a podcast with me at some point. I think what they were doing is saying, let's leverage both the embodied agent by actually having this character that's in the game and things can happen to it, all in text. It's not a 3D world or anything like that. But then let's also have the strategic part so that they can make decisions and even control their own character as if it's another agent. So I think that one, and again, historically accurate is so problematic for us, and I use it all the time myself, because it leaves open this question of what does it really mean for a game to do that? What I would say is the tactical decisions that you make in Through the Darkest of Times, as far as I know from my limited research, do a reasonably good job being analogous to what resistance people might have done, and to some extent build some historical empathy because there's the fear of being caught. A negative example I've been finding in my historical games class is if you look at games from the 90s that are about imperialism and colonialism, they do a horrifically good job of putting you in the mind of a mechanistic conqueror who's only interested in trying to exploit and expand. So I wish that weren't such a good job, but I think it does a good job there too. Thanks.
Next is Sarah, who raised her hand to ask a question, and then Vinicius in the chat.
Hi, thank you so much for this awesome talk. Since you mentioned historical accuracy, I was wondering what are your thoughts about it, especially considering that whenever you, as a developer or a consultant, whatever you decide to represent the world and agencies and characters in a specific way, you kind of pick a side, one interpretation along many there might be. And we know that archaeology is a lot about interpretations, and there might be, different opinions regarding, I don't know, what the Acropolis looked like in the 5th century BC, or,
right,
what a temple in ancient Egypt used to be, visited by local people. And so I was wondering, like, in the case that we're trying, or to use video games as educational tools, how do we deal with that? Like,
sure. So this is how I started my whole whatever career it is in historical game studies, is thinking about the educational side. For me, what I would say is, take everything you said, it's absolutely true, and leverage that by getting students to play but critique. That the best way to handle it is to not, I don't want anything in my history class, not even me, to be a source of authority all the time that people are getting stuff from. What I want them to do is think about representations of the past and think about how well supported they are by the evidence. So I would want to go through and actually say, what are the choices you're getting to make in this game? Do these choices map onto the choices that a real historical figure had at the time? And if so, what's the evidence that supports you there? But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we are getting more games that are more diverse in the perspectives of the characters they're picking, but not that many, right? We still have a very undiverse sort of player agent worldview. And so that's a great example. So for example, playing Oregon Trail, which is available on the Internet Archive, and When Rivers Were Trails, which is freely available on itch.io, that's a great example. Have them play the Imperialist game and then have them play When Rivers Were Trails and look at some evidence and think about how vastly different the experiences are depending on the player agent. So I would say, lean into it and provide rich materials to your students so that they can ask those questions. I would have them going through and diagramming it and looking at the different parts and then coming up with an argument about how it fits. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it's great if you have like a classroom settings. I had some comments on a questionnaire that I submitted for a paper. And some of the people said that, well, they grew up playing video games and they thought that, the narrative in that specific case was a narrative between the Native American populations and the coloners. And they were like, they told me that they believed what was in the video game until they, became older and they read through history books and realized that the narrative was totally misleading. And so in that case, they just played for fun, but somehow, I guess that it is a bias of the player to take the narrative that is presented by the video game as true by default. And so if you don't have a classroom that can kind of discuss that, I guess it's a risk, right? It's a big risk. And so people still believe that, pyramids was built by the Indians, or like Atlantis sank in the sea or something like that, right? So
Right.
yeah, I guess it's a more than an open question,
Yeah,
point for
but
future
yeah,
discussions.
yeah, no, and I'm with you. Lisa Gilbert wrote a great article recently about Assassin's Creed and how school-age kids playing it, not for school, but playing it, how they very much felt that it was a more authentic history. And that one, going back to my first questions, that one was more about the dialogue sequences and the cut scenes, or whatever you call them these days. So yeah, it's a real problem. In the classroom, I say this is exactly why teachers aren't replaced by video games. Teachers need to be the guide along the way, helping out with this. In the real world, yeah, I'm just going to agree with your open comment, right? It's a big issue that we face as a discipline, and hopefully, right? Hopefully conversations like these that we're having, and the ability of people to sort of post more on games and talk more about games, hopefully will be a corrective to like the really bad representations, but I think it's always going to be a challenge. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for your questions. We have a few more in the chat. The next one is from Vinicius Marino, and he says, on the topic of walking simulators, in the context of embodied versus non-embodied agents, where do you situate games with individual PCs that are not entirely realized, and where the environment, rather than the player's avatar, is the main character? For example, walking simulators, but also hidden object games, old school adventure games, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is that I need to think about this some more, and hopefully we'll get to talk about it, my friend. I think the operative distinction is there a point that the camera focuses on where powers come from, or is there no point where the camera focuses and no point where the powers come from? So, Papers, Please, I would argue, is an embodied agent game, because what they've done is locked you into this, right? That's the one where you're the border agent checking people's passes and passports. There you go. Words are failing me. Passports and things like that. They put you in that room, you cannot move from that room, and all you can do is move things around on the desk. So I would argue that they've got an embodied player agent there, and what they're trying to do is actually show how confining it is for this person, and that this is the only area where they have control. You take a Civilization, right, where you can command whole cities, move your camera around everywhere, so you're really kind of arguably disinterested. I need to think about this some more, but separated from the action in a way that you're not in the embodied agents. Walking simulators, I've only played one, Edith Finch, The Remains of Edith Finch, and that to me struck me as an embodied player agent. It struck me as you are exploring this world as a person moving around, and you have, even though it's off screen, you have a mass, you have a body. I don't know if that's actually answering all you're saying, Vinicius, but that's kind of where I am, is that walking simulators, I think, are on the embodied side.
Even though they're not historical agents, because if you think about those old school games, sometimes you play as a voyeur. You just explore, you know, what something else did. It's just...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you did say, okay. Yeah, right. And that is definitely possible. I tend to, particularly when I'm a teacher, be most interested in games that have some kind of archetypal or historical player agent, but I absolutely am aware that the term historical game can be widely expansive and deal with games where you are a fictional agent. I still think, again, you got to work on it, but I still think there's something there about whether they embodied the player agent or not. But yeah, you're going to find all sorts of games like that where you're very fictional. And it would be an interesting question. I guess what I would say is it's an interesting question at some point whether the historical problem space framework, it's going to exist in a game where there's no historical agent, but it may not have a lot of explanatory power for how that game's representing the past. You know, and that's an interesting question. I will say that the problem space framework is at its best when you're comparing and contrasting. So contrasting one of those old adventure games with another game and kind of seeing from the difference between them how they're approaching things. I don't know if that answers your question, but thanks.
Next, we have a comment from Henny, who thanks you for your presentation and says, I have more like a general thoughts comment rather than a question. I'm currently doing my master's thesis on environmental agency in video games, also using close reading. It was interesting to see research being done in different fields as well and how they connect to each other in some level. When it comes to environmental games, mostly climate change, the studies mostly talk about serious games and not so much about commercial games like in this study of yours. I found it fascinating how agency can be framed in so many ways. I really got some new perspective to this matter.
Oh, fantastic.
That's
very
great.
Nice. Yeah, thank you so much. I think, yeah, it's a fascinating field. I've got this book on Roman history that I have to write. So, which means I'm spending too much time on the video game side because that's more interesting at the moment. But I am trying to ground myself in all the work that's been done on avatars. And I've read a little bit of environmental storytelling, that book. Yeah, I think that a lot of these things I'm hoping will just ring as true that you may have known, but you might not have thought about them before. And I hope they're giving just sort of an angle to kind of think a little bit more. I don't know if it's actually Kantian. I guess it probably is, right? At the end of the day, I'm saying a game puts a set of lenses on you, and you can only see the world in terms of those lenses that the game kind of puts on you. And so at the end of the day, I'm so glad you found some interesting stuff about agents, because I think that's what's going on. The game is shaping it into a gamic history, and we can understand better what that is if we think more about those constituent parts. Thank you so much.
Next, we have a question from Giles. I hope I'm saying your name right. If you want, you can also ask by voice if you rather do that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Jeremiah, for your talk. And I just have a quick question for you, because in relation to your teaching experience, perhaps you could speak a bit more to the successes and challenges that you've encountered in implementing the historical problem space framework in the classroom.
Yeah, sure.
For example, how well do...
Oop, I lost you a little bit, Gilles.
You're freezing a little bit, yeah.
Perhaps you can speak more to that.
I missed that second part. You froze.
Yeah, sorry if the internet may be not so good. The second part was how well did you, in your experience, how well do your students catch on to the educational goals that you set in using the HPS framework? So how does it work in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is, I think that and this is getting so idealistic, so I'm sorry, but I get very excited by these things. I think you start transforming your history class. I think you start talking a lot about agents in worlds with choices, and those agents that we never get to, read about are not enough, right? With all the advances we've made in social history and gendered history and racial history and all these things, right? There are all these people out there that are trying to navigate a world and have choices and agency as they're doing it. So for me, it's actually been the most valuable, I think, when I start to try and talk about whatever the historical topic is we are working on in terms of agency, and I try to get my students to start to analyze a situation like a problem space. This is a sort of a very stock example, but look at Hammurabi's code and try and figure out what exactly Hammurabi was doing in ancient history to come up with the laws that they did. Or look at Roman women protesting the Oppian laws in the Republic and how they decided to affect political change through that. And then I'll put a pitch in here too, Gilles. This is also a great place to use Twine and interactive text, which I've done a lot of work on, because it lends itself very much to this idea of pick your protagonist and tell me about the world they're in and the kind of decisions they face. So I, like every teacher, it's so much clearer in my head than I'm ever able to teach it, right? And some days I think I've done a better job, and some days I despair. But I think overall, it gives an angle to talking about games that works because it breaks it down and has you think about it rather than just taking this whole mass of information and saying, what do I do with it now? So right. I've found it really helpful in the classroom.
So in a way, it's a reflection in your own shift in teaching history. The HPS framework has formalized your way of teaching.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I got to a certain point because I try to use games in the classroom. I use games in the classroom because I think there's a historical value to studying them. I don't use them because they'll be fun, because my experience is they're not fun for everybody. I have a lot of kids right next door I'm going to go teach in a little bit who do not find video games fun. But they're worthwhile because of this problem space analysis. And so, yeah, I've gotten to a certain point where I've gone, if this is a way of thinking about the world, and I should stop here, folks. I mean, let's be really clear. Problem space analysis has a lot of issues, right? I mean, this leads to treating yourself as an agent and instrumentalizing everybody else, right? Treating them as only tools. So there's a lot of problems here, but I think that becomes part of the discourse, talking with students about those things. So yeah, it's definitely shaped my teaching.
Okay, thank you, Jeremiah.
Thanks.
If you have time, we have a couple more questions. There's one from Emmy in the chat, and there is then Robert who has a raised hand, but I will read this question here first. Thank you for your talk. This has been the highlight of my week. From a designer point of view, what other tools or frameworks besides HPS do you recommend us designers to use when we do the design decision within historical framework? I'm planning my master's thesis on the topic designing game narrative with counterfactuals from praxeological point of view. So I'm really interested to find sources.
Yeah. So great question. So we're getting there. We don't have a lot of material out on this. Ylva Grufstedt is going to have a book out soon where she'll be looking at counterfactuals in great detail, and I think that'll be really helpful. Adam Chapman's Games of Digital History is a go-to work. He and I, our methods are complementary, but and a little overlappy, but you really can get sort of different things out of each one. And he talks about things like, well, mostly like what the historical approach of these games is, which it sounds like it's really similar to me, but we're actually really complementary. So Adam Chapman's work, you should look at. I don't know, all of my stuff's on Gaming the Past, and I can give you the articles if you don't have it. So I've been kind of working through this space for at least a decade, so I would go there too. Those are the only things that I know of at the moment that are kind of focusing on that part. But I think this is becoming more and more important. There are some of us who are talking increasingly about how our designers are approaching things. It's a sort of historiography, right? We want to know how the person making the history kind of approaches the content. So anyways, those are some places where you definitely could look, and please feel free to send me a note sometime. I love talking shop anytime.
Robert, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Jeremiah. That was really informative. That was it's a really complex, really useful system. You're quietly framework rather. You're quietly constructing there, which I'll be poaching very mercilessly shortly. There's a whole lot of stuff I want to ask you, but I suppose I'll keep it relatively tight. When you're talking about different genres representing history in different ways, is there any way we can tie that to different types of history? So, for example, Battlefield, it's big, obviously military history, but it's from a fairly social standpoint. It's very heavy on material culture. Meanwhile, something like Hearts of Iron, yes, it's also military history, but it's much more political. There's different social elements, much more macro. And is that a potentially useful way to tie it back to teaching about historiography?
Yeah, so I think, and actually I'm glad you mentioned that. Martin Wainwright also has written a book recently whose name escapes me, but it's Games in History. And he very much goes into this idea of using certain games as lenses on economic theory, using certain games as lenses on political theory. I think the answer is yes, but this is one of those many areas that I'd love to explore and take some guidance from you on. I think that, and Adam Chapman, of course, does this really interesting job looking at, for example, his distinction between a realist simulation approach, right, which is focused on sort of verisimilitudinous, sorry for that word, verisimilitudinous visuals, and a conceptual approach, which is more on abstract, and that's really useful too. What I'm finding that's interesting is that the embodied and disembodied player agent doesn't map exactly to that. I can get more cases in with embodied and disembodied. For example, Cat and the Coup, right, where you're the cat with the former prime minister of Iran, whose name escapes me, is going through being arrested, and sort of these critical parts of regime change. And sure enough, you're the cat. So that means you focus on one frame at a time, and you only go to the next section after one section's been completed, and the actual game mechanics focus on you batting stuff around. So I suspect that embodied agents are going to be better at representing a world around them, a physical world. And I'm not the only person who said this. And so that has the potential for social history in great ways, because you can go around and dialogue with people, and you can really have, people on the street. And of course, there's all these problems of representing them, but they're at least there. And you got me all over the place, because even a unembodied agent, right, in a strategy game, if you're playing a paradox strategy game, that might be a lot of social processes that you're involved in as you're sliding things around. So I'm going to say, yes, I think it probably does have some connections, and I need to explore them more. That's a great question.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant.
Thanks.
So we have more questions. I don't know how much time you have, but
give me one moment, and I will come back, and I will have at least 10 more minutes.
Great.
All right, I have very good kids, so I got 15 minutes. Here we go.
Perfect. We have a question from Ylva. Thank you very much for a great presentation, Jeremiah. As has already come up, I think the HPS really shines in demonstrating the multiplicity of historical games and play beyond genre. At the same time, we do also see a certain homogeneity or repetition in design over time. Do you see any risks here? And then there's a second part of the question, and apologies for the prognostic nature of this question, but are we heading towards more or less nuance in gamic history, do you think?
Yeah, great questions, right? I think whole big subject, right? And there are people who don't like genre very much who are going to just groan at everything I'm saying. So sorry. I think that absolutely we see historical games often getting locked more and more into their own personal genres. Like Assassin's Creed, right, is effectively a genre of its own. And as I said, I got so excited the other day when I was playing and I saw that example. I don't know if it was all, hopefully it was clear to you all, but that you take this war on a grand scale and you turn it into a personal agent going around stealing stuff and killing people is a great example of those genre pressures. So I think that's going on, but independent developers are doing such great work with games. We the Revolution from Polyslash and Through the Darkest of Times and When Rivers Were Trails. And so I think we're finding more and more in that space that genres are blending. Through the Darkest of Times has sort of a pretty standard kind of strategy component, but then they take interactive text with its personal story-based features and they loop you in that way. So I think absolutely there are genre influences that continue on. I assume that they will continue on because I assume that designers are designing because they're designers and have designer goals. And one of the designer goals is having a game that people actually want to play. And having a game that people actually want to play is oftentimes helped by following a pattern that you know that they enjoyed in the past. So I assume that will keep going on, but I'm hoping that certainly in the independent sphere that we will see more and more expansion and breaking free of these genres and maybe taking parts of it. It's interesting. I'm working sort of on and off with a friend and colleague who's here today on a Roman history video game. And we've had the interesting experience that I've also had as a teacher of stopping and saying, here's the history. What game mechanics would map that the most effectively? And that's a fantastic question. And I don't think it's a question that most game designers can ask themselves a lot, pragmatically. I think rather, and please, designer friends, tell me if I'm mistaken here. I need your input so much, but it seems to me, at least in the interviews and talks I've done, that game designers more say, I'm going to make an Assassin's Creed game about industrial England. I'm going to make a Paradox game about 19th century, right? When Vicky 3 comes out, whenever that is. And not what game mechanics would best represent this historical reality. And that's okay. That's totally okay. I just think that we should probably be aware of that. And maybe indie game developers, because they're not so necessarily tied to kind of big expectations, can do a little more of that, because that's when it gets really fascinating, when you start saying, what type of game would actually represent this history in the best analogical way? Which, by the way, those of you who are interested in teaching, that's a fantastic question to ask your students, right? What would be a better form of game for this? What was your second question, Ilva? I got it?
Yeah, I think you did. The second part was more just basically whether we're heading towards more nuance or less, but you did answer that.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Thank you.
We have a raised hand from Nikhil, if you want to go.
Hi, Dr. McCall.
Hi, Nikhil.
Yeah, really good to see how HPS has developed. I'm really happy to see the progression in the theory.
Thank you so much.
This is slightly involved. So I think about a lot is with early movies, right? There's that famous clip of the train going towards the camera and everybody running out of the theater, right?
Right.
And with video games, I think that people are still not quite systems literate. And you mentioned this with Assassin's Creed, in that players sort of take the systems as gospel truth because they haven't really gotten to the point where they look at the systems and ask themselves, does this system make sense or not? Because they ask themselves, given this system, what can I do? And not, would a different system make more sense here? So a lot of feedback that you get as a game designer tends to be very much in the details, because people who play games struggle to see the bigger picture of the game and like ask themselves, does this system make sense at all?
Sure.
And and this links to the fact that of these games, of most of the games that you've covered, the Paradox games, the Firaxis games, the Assassin's Creed games, game genre is important because a lot of the times the game designers start with the genre and then put the history on top, as you just said. And what this, I feel, implies is that a system meant to analyze these historical games then can be applied to a lot of non-historical games as well, because the games have so much similarity between them. If I'm playing Endless Legend or Endless Space, it is very, very similar to Civilization, because they said, what if I take Civilization and put it in space? So my question is, how much do you think HPS is historical versus how much do you think it is just helping students understand helping students become more literate about systems as a whole?
Fantastic question. Yeah. So that is one of the huge questions, right? Is it the fact, so stipulating for a moment, and again, there may be examples out there, but let's just say every game that I have seen so far, and I'm limited in what I have seen, that is historical, has this problem space design. So the question is, right, is that because the game design shapes it that way, or is it that designers pick topics that tend to fit there? And I guess I don't really know how to separate the two. I guess I guess it seems to me that it's fundamentally about a game itself. And right, and we can debate what a game is, but if we're going to take a definition that's somewhere along the lines of a player with rules and some kind of outcome that they're trying to achieve, that right there sounds generally very much like a problem space. And so I guess I think that it is that. Can you re-ask your second part? Because you had something about like endless space in there, and I feel like I'm not getting to that, and I want to get to that.
What I'm saying is that I think HPS can, I think I could actually use HPS to and go through the pieces, go through each of the categories you put down, and use those to analyze completely non-historical games with absolutely no. Right. So really, my question comes down to how much is it just teaching systems literacy and then using systems literacy as a way to teach history, in that by putting players in the position of someone in these systems, they now can understand the historical space versus just teaching the historical problem space as itself.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so I have for years, I'm actually excited that I don't have to use Civilization next year in the classroom, because it's a beast and it's really, really hard to teach because it's complicated to play. But when I've used that, one of the things I've tried to get people involved in is look at the main variables. I would argue that a historical problem space analysis, if you're doing it thoroughly, would go into those very features you're talking about, right? Culture, for example, great example, is represented as a quantifiable variable in the game. And so discussions with people about how does culture change and can it be measured and what kind of influences does it have are definitely part of it. So yes, absolutely. I think that that's, you know, as a Roman historian by training, I was brought up on all anecdotal evidence, right? It's all text accounts of individuals, sometimes second, third, or fourth hand. And so I've definitely found in my own teaching that systems teaching, which I'm still not great at, but systems teaching is more and more important. And I actually think video game histories have brought me to that. Not because they do it well. Well, I should qualify. They do systems thinking very well. It may not actually be historically grounded systems thinking. So, you know, that sort of process of saying, okay, let's talk about the systems that are in place. Yeah, that's absolutely, absolutely. I think more systems thinking in general for kids and less sort of isolated examples is a good thing. That's a great question. Thanks, Nikhil.
I think if it's not too long, we can make Derek the last question so that you can get back to your job also.
This has been great. Thank you, folks.
Yeah. Well, yes, thank you for this marvelously inspiring talk that you have given. I have enjoyed it tremendously. It is such importance. I am myself a university senior lecturer here at so I teach a little bit older kids.
Thank you.
There are so many questions that we could continue discussing, because I'm personally, because I come from archaeology and nationalism studies, right. I'm interested in the dark side of games as politics, sure. Making politics through games, and also in how the fantastic can be historical as well, how our historical values and moralities are also present in games that really are not even supposed to be historical. But all of this will be left to future seminars.
Please email me sometime so we can talk about it, though. I would love to talk about that. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for this, and I hope that we can keep in touch, and that this marvelous group of people now present here, and some of them also already had to leave, will be meeting on other Zooms and fora soon enough. I just wish to give my thanks from the point of view of the seminar, that we have had this really excellent discussion with enormously interesting questions and discussions. Thank you.
No, I agree. Thank you so much, everybody, for your interest. And I'll say it again, please. There's nothing I like better than someone writing me an email and just asking me to talk about this stuff with you. So I really appreciate all your time and all your interesting questions. And I hope you found something useful. So thank you, Derek. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah. Our pleasure.
It was really great to have you. I'm glad that we could organize this and that we had so many people show up and ask these really interesting questions. Thank you, everybody who listened and asked and participated here. I think we can wrap it up so that everyone can get back to work or other endeavors that we have to do.
Terrific. I look forward to hearing from all of you, hopefully. So have a great day. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay, that went well.
Thank you. Yes.
We can probably stop recording.